Hi, everybody. It's always fun to talk about the Camino. So thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoy it as much as we enjoy telling you about it. I think you may know this, but the Camino is actually many ways all to a single destination. In fact, originally, the idea of the Camino is that you could just walk out of your front door and begin to walk in honor of St. James to Santiago. Santiago, or the full name is Santiago de Compostela. I'm going to translate it for you. Santiago means in Spanish James, and de means of or from, and Compostela is a word that involves stars. It can be translated in different ways. So oftentimes taken together, Santiago de Compostela means field of stars. So we wanted to show that to you on the map. So for those of you in the room, you can see the pointer on the screen. And if you're not in the room, just look at Portugal, and you'll see that Santiago comes in Spain, across the border, northwestern Spain. So traditionally, the Portuguese Way begins in Lisbon, but many people, including us, started in Porto. It's about 262 kilometers from Porto to Santiago. That was our distance involving two variants. So there are variants along the way as well. Now, Jane is going to tell you a little bit about the stamps that we collected.
That's not really on the picture though, is it? The people won't see it on the Zoom.
They will if you hold it up in front of the camera.
Okay. Can you see this? It's the passport. When you start the Camino, your goal is to collect 2 stamps at each of the villages that you go through. And when you get to the end of the Compostela, to the end of the Camino, when you're in Santiago, you go to a special office and they verify that you have met the obligation of getting 2 stamps in each location, and you are then awarded the Compostela certificate. Should I talk about this part?
I'll tell them.
Okay, go ahead.
So a little more about the reason people walk the way. Historically, and this is a medieval walk. Okay, it began about 1,000 years ago, and people have been walking it ever since. Since 2010, it's been especially popular because of the introduction of the movie called The Way with Martin Sheen. So many Americans first heard about the way through that movie, and every year since people, especially Americans, have been going to do the walk. But historically, the reason for the walk from a religious perspective, especially a Catholic perspective, is because of St. James, who was one of the apostles with Jesus in Jerusalem. When he died, his followers took him from Jerusalem to Spain because he had evangelized there, and they knew that he would want his body buried there. So they took him by boat, and tradition has it that there was a shipwreck and that his body was washed up on the shore covered with shells. And that's the reason that pilgrims wear shells on their backpack. And that's the reason that every marker along the way, like this one on the screen right now, includes a shell.
So one of the similarities to the Appalachian Trail is in the blazes on the trail tells you which way to go, and you always look for your blazes. On the Camino, you're looking for the yellow arrow and the stylized shell shape that also kind of resembles a sun, and that tells you that you're on the right way. This is the walkway up to the cathedral in Porto, which is a historically typical place that people will start their Camino walk if they're going to start in Porto. And typical of many cathedrals in Europe, it's a huge edifice and basically almost like a fortress. This is typical of many of the streets in Porto. And as you look at some of these different photos, You'll notice that the sky looks grayish. It's not clouds, it's not haze, it's actually smoke. Because at the time that we were there, we were actually fortunate to get into Porto when we did, because there were so many wildfires that would have been east of the Porto area, that the airport was closed after we got there and so on. And it was really very serious, very devastating for many of the people who live in that area. This is at the top of, this is in front of that cathedral that you saw earlier. This grand statues and beautiful carvings. So again, it's obvious that there's a lot of smoke in the sky. It's not a typical day view for a sunny day. There were no clouds. This was from the smoke. Porto is a good sized city, and we were up the top of a tower to get this photograph. Again, it's getting to be sunset, and the smoke is pretty serious. Another view from that high tower. So the next morning, we got ready to walk out from Porto, and Porto is famous for many of its bridges. That's one of them. And again, you can still see the smoke. So here is a close-up of the packs that we carried on our Camino walk. If you see the shell on the back of someone's pack, that identifies them as a pilgrim. It may or may not be there for a religious reason. People from all over the world, all faiths, no faith, walk the Camino for many, many different reasons. And that's mine. These are day packs because we chose, I had a pretty severely compromised left knee and probably shouldn't have even walked the Camino in September, but because of the fact that I couldn't carry any weight other than a very small amount of what I would need for the day. The nice thing is that people make a living from carting your luggage basically from one place that you're staying to the next, to the next, to the next. And it's all done by reservation ahead of time, very inexpensive. And since I was needing that, Greg agreed he would also have them take his. So that's why you'll see us in day packs. There is no camping along the Camino. You do stay in what are called albergues. And you just need to have what you would if you were on a typical trip where you're maybe driving from place to place. The difference is here, of course, that you're walking. Okay, so that's the end of that one, isn't it? Okay.
So we were walking along the sea. You can tell that that's a beautiful blue sky that's not really quite blue, and it's not because it's a low quality photograph. It's because of the smoke in the air, and that followed us for a few days. But we were delighted to be by the sea.
About the walkways.
The walkways, we're delighted to soak our feet in very cold water. I wouldn't recommend swimming, but it was really cold. Yeah, Jane was mentioning the walkways that we really had a combination of along the sea. There are a lot of boardwalks, and that extends quite far north through Portugal. So you have a lot of wooden boardwalks. People love it. But you also walk on cobblestones, especially in the small villages and towns, and people don't like those so much. Those really hard on your feet. Those are the two main walk. I think those two main surfaces that you walk on.
Trails.
And well, of course, when you're in the forest, the dirt trails, yeah. So you can see some of that. You see that I'm wearing a mask there, and it wasn't for COVID. It was for the smoke. So I think that takes us to the other side.
So this is the village of Villa Cha. It was our third stop on our 20-day trip. And again, the smoke is still a problem. And when we were in Villa Cha, we received word that all walkers, all pilgrims, in fact, everyone who lives there too is told to stay in place, not even to really go outside because it is truly not safe to breathe the air. What you can't see in the faraway spaces there is the ocean, and that's how bad the smoke was. This is typical of one of the little private albergue inns that we would stay in. That's the room. The room is behind me. That's our little porch. very simple, but not resorty, but just a very pleasant place to stay when you're tired after walking. So this is the next day, and we actually were very fortunate because we had been told we had to stay where we were. Because we had reservations at each place we were going to stay on this trip, that meant we kind of got goofed up then on what we were going to do for the night that we had to stay where we were. But the people were very accommodating and said we could stay one more night. It just meant that we skipped then where we would have gone the next day. But as you can see, it was a beautiful day to just spend doing things like I fixed some of the cobblestones that had been knocked out along the way. So I sat and did that for a little while. Then this is typical of all along the Camino, the local economies are often based on people walking through, stopping at restaurants, stopping to buy things. And this was a typical sign that you might see along the bottom of that sign. That is actually the graphic representation of the cathedral in Santiago that you're walking toward. And then you can see the symbol there of the way of the shell, and it says stamp here. So that's typical of where you would stop. You could eat there. You didn't have to. They would give you a stamp on your passport, and you could go on, or you could buy something sweet, or you could buy a whole meal. It was at this restaurant that we met some local people and had a really nice conversation. Greg will tell you about it.
Yeah, so as we went along, we started meeting local residents, and it turns out that people in Portugal are really good at English for the most part, especially the younger people, because they've studied it in school. And that was a contrast to Spain. I'm studying Spanish right now to get ready to go back, and I'll need a little bit of Spanish to do that. But in Portugal, it wasn't really mostly a problem. So at this restaurant, it was really just about 2 or 3 days in, I guess, is we had our first really in-depth conversation with a couple that was at this restaurant. So we were sitting beside them, and I noticed that this other pilgrim was leaving the restaurant, and they were noticing it too. And she had a big pack, and she was really struggling with this big pack, taking it up the stairs. And so I didn't know if they were English speaking. So but I wanted to communicate to our people across the table. So I just picked up our little day pack and held it up and showed it to them, and we could laugh about it. And then it turned out, of course, they knew English, and we ended up having a great talk. So through them, we learned about what we needed to make sure we didn't miss seeing on the way up the trail. And he was a photographer. He told us his favorite spots to go out and take pictures. He had walked the way all the way to Santiago several times. So he's able to tell us, oh, this isn't near as bad as what you're going to find up north, in terms of difficulty, because so far we've had no difficulty. This has just been a beautiful walk in the park up until now. Then it started occurring to us that really an important part of this trip was going to be talking to local residents, and we did. Sometimes I remember rounding a corner and having 2 beach guys stop me. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? I mean, you could tell a pilgrim a mile away. They'd stop me and say, they don't know if we're Americans until we speak. Before that, we could be Germans, we could be Australians, you could, be English from England. But once we speak, they know. So he stopped me and asked me to speak, and I did. And then he knew where I was from, and he said, "What do you think about Trump?" So I had to go and say, no, he's not going to. Don't worry, he's not going to be elected. And I've always felt guilty about telling him that when a month later he was. So.
One thing I should point out, as you look at the map on the right, each of those circles represents a place that we stayed. A typical day was about 10 miles, probably. It's not great distances that you're covering.
10 to 16.
10 to 16 miles a day. And as we go through this takes you to
Yeah, let me see.
the video here shows you this beautiful coastline in the place that we were forced to stay for a day. So it could have been a whole lot worse. Just beautiful. And basically, you notice we're the only ones there. This was in late September last year. So it's probably a little late for the local people to be out. Just a typical beach that is not so typical because we were the only ones there. But it was really a pleasant surprise. We didn't really know. We knew it was the coastal route, but we had no idea that it would be that lovely. It's a very rugged coastline through there. So then we go inland more. There you go. How do we do that? Yeah.
So now we're going to see a different side of the Camino because we were on the coastal route and now we're moving to the central route. Central route is really the more traditional way, and it takes you a little bit inland, and it takes you through small villages and through small towns and just through the countryside and a lot of farmland. And so that's the experience we now had, which was really very, very different. You'll notice that on a lot of the markers along the way, there'll be keepsakes, or actually not keepsakes isn't the word, is it? Leave behinds that people, what was important to people to leave along the way, they oftentimes pile on top of the way this pile is on top of the markers.
And you can see in that one tell about the 209 kilometers each.
Oh, yeah, and you can also see the 209 kilometers. That's the distance from that marker to Santiago. And this is an elaborate collection of leave behinds. And once again, the markers that are sometimes embedded in the wall like this instead of put on posts. A lot of the bridges that we go over go back to, at least their foundations do, go back to Roman times. So the history is just everywhere and the art is just everywhere. And the rain began to be just everywhere. Just to show you that this reminds us of an American farmer.
It was a John Deere tractor.
It's a John Deere tractor, right?
You have to go up and close it.
Yeah.
So here you see the yellow brick road. Yellow is obviously one of the colors of the trail, and I think this is kind of just a humorous way of, instead of having the arrows, they made the walkway yellow. Typical gardens. I love dahlias, so I had to take that one. Many of the villages have small chapels at their center, and this is typical of what you would see. The building on the left in this picture is a public albergue, different from where we stayed. They're like dormitories. You cannot get reservations. The historic basis of the Camino was that there were these places where you could stop when you got tired, and they were open to the public, and they're still open. It costs about $10 a night to have a bed and a shower, and food is extra, but not very much. All along the Camino are these lovely bakeries, cafes, and so it's very different from the AT in that way. You can go one to one to one to the next, and then it's a great way to keep yourself going through the day. Again, you can see here the vineyards that we would pass through, and that dirt walkway there is, at this point, that's the trail. You can see in the middle of the photo there, the arrow. And there was a funny thing about the arrows. Sometimes we couldn't find the arrows, and we would start walking along, and someone would come along, and they'd go like this, waving at us, and they go like this. Like, we had obviously turned the wrong way, and so we would know to go back. People were very helpful that way. Again, a little chapel out. This was out in the middle of nowhere, but it was typical of what we would see. And you'll see there the fancy embedded sign, and then down below, sometimes all you had was someone who had painted a yellow arrow on the marker. This is one of our very favorite places. This was called Fernanda. That's the name of the woman who owns this refugio. Refugio, what am I saying? Albergue. And very unique, is famous along the Camino, and we were very fortunate to be able to stay here. You can see me there. It's a farm, but it's very much a kind of a hippie haven. And we walked in, and everyone is lounging underneath these canopies, and she would bring out food that she'd made, just bring it out. So this is in here because we were among the older guests that night, and she had us placed in a public room, and that was fine. But then she took us aside and she said, "Wouldn't you like to have your own room?" We said, "Okay, sure." So this is the room she gave us, all just very lovely, had our own private bathroom. So sometimes it helps to be among the older crowd. You get perks that way. Okay, you ready?
So little did we know that the privacy that we'd enjoyed up until now, being able to choose to be alone when we wanted to be alone. Sometimes Jane and I would walk separately, or sometimes we'd walk together, but there really were not very many pilgrims with us most of the time. But little did we know that would change. So I'm just giving you the heads up now. Enjoy it while you can. Look at that beautiful empty trail. Through a lot of farm fields, a lot of leave behinds. There's your cobblestones. Beautiful places. And that's stepping up into a town called Ponte de Lima. Ponte means bridge, de means of, and Lima is the place name. So it's the bridge of Lima, Ponte de Lima. And we took a rest day there.
About that street.
Oh, yeah. You're better at that.
Not necessarily. This was in Ponte de Lima, and we walked up here to get to the albergue we were staying in that night, and you can see that it's kind of under construction. The buildings are obviously old, and when they decided to redo the street, it's really nice. They replaced it with cobblestone rather than putting down asphalt or something. Very nice touch to keep the historic relevance there. Lots of interesting art, sculptures, paintings all along the way. Bom Camino is what that says, if you can read it down there. We're still in Portugal. So that is the Portuguese phrase for good Camino. Typical small chapel in which you could go in and get your stamp done for the day and rest. This is in Ponte de Lima, where Greg was just talking about it, and typical larger city. And we had a very luxurious meal there for lunch. This is the albergue we stayed there. Kind of like a hotel almost. This building was very spooky to us. That large wall on Greg's right is the wall of this prison. There were no windows in this prison. It was very kind of scary. But they preserved this just in the middle of this large metropolitan area, just because it is historically significant. And there is the Ponte de Lima, the famous bridge that takes you across then to the other side of the river. Really a beautiful, beautiful scene. So then, this is a significant. This was taken out of one of the books that we brought with us, and it shows you the elevation of the daily's climb. So you can tell we're in for quite a hike that day, and but it's all on the trail and it's all easily followed. This is just after I think we crossed the bridge in Ponte de Lima that this one is taken, and you can see it's starting to rain. We did not do any of these hearts or other things that you're going to see, but someone ahead of us had done that across the bridge. Same thing there. So now you can tell it's changed quite a bit. This almost is reminiscent of the AT. You're on a dirt trail going through forests, no buildings, but you do see the arrow here, see the yellow arrow. In the same way that you might see a blaze on the AT. typical, very small chapel in a small town. And there you have a little bit of Roxylvania there, right? Should bring back happy memories. That was relatively unusual, but so this is one of the, I call them the shrines. It's where people leave there. People bring things from home or they gather them along the way. And for a special reason, they would leave them at these places. Oh, yes. And this was significant because I looked in the middle, right about in here, in the middle of this, and there was a Congressional Medal of Honor that someone had left there. It was a man's whose picture, his name is on it. His picture is on the back of it. And it makes you wonder, did someone else leave that there in his honor? Did he leave it there for a special reason? You never know. But each one of these little tiny objects that you see there had special meaning to someone, and they chose to leave it there. Really beautiful, just walking through nature. Then again, you get back to the cobblestones. This is actually their pavement. Little villages out in the farms. I think every little town did have their own church. This was a major surprise. We had a reservation to stay here, didn't know how to pool, but this was the view out of our little room. And in the distance, you can see the mountains. So we did have some nice surprises.
So I should probably explain that we stayed in private albergues and hostels. We never stayed in a hotel. But the private albergues are a little fancier than the municipal albergues. And maybe some of you have been on the ways and you know that. So just, we needed to do that in order to take advantage of the baggage transfer service. Those had to be delivered to private albergues because the municipal albergues would have nobody, sitting at a desk waiting for a bag and making sure you got your bag checked in and all that. So that's why we're staying in a little bit nicer places. But they're still not nearly as expensive as what we're talking about spending. So over there, the municipal albergues can be 10 euros, 12 euros a day. So, $13 or $14 a day, maybe. Whereas the private albergues might be 20 euro a day, maybe even 30 euro a day. So they're still fairly inexpensive, but they are a cut above in a lot of ways. So this turned out to be the halfway. All those signs. We stood there looking at those signs, and it dawned on me, I guess, that we were halfway there. Because I knew how far we had come, and I knew how far we had to go, and it was about 135 kilometers either way. So that was kind of a fun thing to figure out while we were walking by. Art is everywhere, right? And I consider this art too. And this. And the chapel's a constant presence. What's interesting about some of these cross markers is before, I think maybe 100 years ago or so is when the shells started being established the way we think of blazes on the AT. Before that, they were crosses like this. So when people were walking away, they were looking for crosses instead of shells. That was
the yellow arrow.
And the yellow arrow, yeah. Instead, they were looking for this. So we're standing on the bridge over the Minho River, and that's the border with Spain. Of course, it's raining, and it's raining hard, and it's really, really windy on that bridge. I mean, we just about got blown off that bridge. So, but this is a look that we're adopting now. This is our look. It's sort of like the wet rat look. So we're crossing over into España, in the town of Tui. And this is our albergue for that night, which was most like, I think, a municipal albergue that we had stayed in.
That particular albergue is a converted monastery. There are several of those along the way. So just like on the AT, you do sometimes need help with your feet. And so we discovered all kinds of things that we could get in the small towns to help us because we did have some trouble. We were able to continue going, but without this help on our feet, I don't think we would have made it. The sun is out and it's a lovely trip for these few days here. But I think you get the sense that a lot of it is very, very remote. Some of the times you're going through small towns, occasionally through big cities, and we'll see one of those in a minute. But the walk here, if you can see my cursor, that is the actual walk. Those stones are set next to the water that way. So now we're starting to see more people along with us. Some more art. Greg loved this old guy painting of an old pilgrim.
Viejo Peregrino,
Yeah,
old pilgrim.
we can relate to that.
That's me.
Here's a good example of one of the Roman bridges that has been there since Roman times. Obviously has been refurbished a few times, but that is just amazing to think of it. And then in the background, you have the power lines. So at this point, it had been raining enough to where the waterways were getting a little crazy. Here you can see the trail is flat, almost like slate rocks. Another big climb that day. You want to go? I'll advance it. Another unusual type of shrine here, built for people to leave their things in. And now we're back to seeing the water.
Yeah, so this was another up and down day, as you could tell. And one thing I want to say about something that I in particular noticed was this relationship between the physical and the mental. So as you saw the blister, so now we're starting to feel it. We're what, 9-10 days into 12 days into the walk now. We're really starting to feel it. We're having to drain blisters sometimes. We're having to bandage up at the end of every single day. Making sure we're taking the Advil, etc. So the physical is becoming harder, and then we're facing some really hard climbs too. And we're getting close to what's called the spiritual variant, which intentionally takes you up in the mountains and down to the sea. So what I noticed was that during those times, my mind seemed to be stimulated as well as my body. My body hurt, but it seemed to turn on my brain somehow. And it turned out that I was remembering why I thought the question I had when I came. When we went to the Camino, I came with a question. This was just before the presidential election in November. We were walking in September, and it was a very tumultuous time, not knowing what the future would be like. And I wanted an answer to the question that I couldn't answer, and that was how am I to be, and how am I to act, and how am I to behave in these times? And I thought I would find that on the Camino. That's what I went looking for. And we're 12 days in and I haven't found it yet. And that occurs to me at this confluence of physical and mental. That hasn't occurred to me or that hasn't happened yet. But what did happen was an unexpected finding. And that was that, and I know this through my dreams and through my waking thoughts, that an issue that had a lifelong issue really with me was being resolved, and I was sleeping better, and I wasn't consumed with this repetitive thinking about that issue. And that is what I found on the Camino. Buen Camino Peregrino.
There's some graffiti.
So now I neglected to say that when we cross the border, bom dia becomes buenos dias. So bom dia means good day in Portuguese. Welcome, hello, bom dia, good day. Cross the border, it's got to be buenos dias.
Little change in the blazes here. Once in a while, you get kind of creative, but you know that that's the way you need to be going. But just look at the beauty there. It's breathtakingly spectacular to see these places. Another old bridge crossing another river. It's a railway bridge taking trains from Lisbon on up to Santiago. Just some Mhm.
Oh.
And Greg and Jane become closer on the Camino.
This is just a typical home that we would walk past. Actually, this was out in the country. I was intrigued with these country houses. It was farming, but they were obviously pretty well-off farmers. So now, is this when we're getting down into the spiritual variant yet? Nope, no, oh, okay. This shot is in a city, but this crib, we couldn't figure out what these were. We thought it was a tiny chapel. It turns out that has been built up around by the city, and it was what the farmers used to store their crops. And fortunately, a lot of them have been saved.
It's called an Oreo. Oreo.
Oreo.
Mhm. They're used as granaries.
So here, before we go much farther, you can see here where I'm circling, we're getting close up to Santiago at this point. We're well into Spain. This is the Galicia area of Spain. And so we're in the big city now of Pontevedra. Having a nice meal. A larger cathedral. And I think that's the same shot again of the Oreo. Bigger cathedral. Some sculptures in Pontevedra. This is significant because Greg actually used to own a Triumph motorcycle exactly like that in 1970. So it was a riot to see it in the
Yeah,
middle of
somehow it
Pontevedra.
ended up there.
Yeah,
Mine was red though.
this is the hotel, or not hotel, it's the Hostel Blues Inn. Our room is up there, so this is obviously a very nice example of
Private albergue.
one of the private albergues. But again, it had dorm rooms in it. We just happened to get a room for 6, but there's only 2 of us in there. So, I mean, it had 6 beds, but we're the only ones there. I'm gonna go through these a little bit faster because I think we're running out of time. Typical family day, blowing bubbles in the plaza. This is taken from the top view. You can walk up into the dome of this cathedral, and it was fun to look down. So typical stamp here. Notice that's in English. A lot of the rest of it is in Spanish, probably. Pilgrim's Mass is mentioned there. So they are trying to accommodate both English and Spanish speaking people. Okay, this I love because if you can get your head around this, that little part in the middle of the bottom of the picture is one of the corn cribs along with an old shed and the old wall. And then you've got this modern high-rise apartment building. But I think it's really admirable that they would save this at least and have it for future generations to admire. This particular chapel is interesting. It's a circular building and it is dedicated to St. James de Santiago, and it is in Pontevedra. Okay, so here's an example of one of the albergues. There are 6 of these bunk beds in this big room, but we were the only ones who had the reservations. So we got this large room to ourselves with our own bathroom. But it would not be unusual to have then other people sleeping in the room too. It really cuts down on the cost, so you can share it with other people. How are we doing on time?
You're fine.
Okay, so now we're back into kind of the wilderness. Starting to rain again.
This is after Pontevedra, so
Yeah.
we're beginning the spiritual variant. You
This
want me to
is,
talk about
yeah,
that?
you go ahead. This is the beginning of the spiritual variant, and it's
So this is where we left most people behind because we'd started encountering more and more pilgrims along the way, but most of them turned right and we turned left. So by walking up the spiritual variant, that's what I described earlier, is up and over. It took us right into the forest, and I'll show you what that looked like. Just incredible, interesting forests.
a lot of eucalyptus
Oh,
trees.
yeah, the eucalyptus trees. And a monastery along the way in a little town called Pollo, where they have
Mosaic.
mosaics like you've never seen before, all hand built. You can imagine such a thing, just walls full of this. So we were a little unusual. We took trail lightweight umbrellas with us and used those sometimes instead of the ponchos. And then when it got really bad, we had to have both. So it's an albergue hostel, Nuestra Senora del Camino. We're back down to the sea.
Fishing village.
Yeah. So oh yeah. So that was a really hard hike that day. And it was uphill and it got raining pretty seriously. And I don't know how other people handled those situations. But what I did was make up a song in my head, and it was a brilliant song, and I totally forgot it now. But it might have had to do with the rain in Spain falls only on Jane.
Something like that. So this is a page out of the book. John Brierley is a legendary Camino guide, and he wrote these very detailed books. His daughter has since taken these up to keep them current when he passed away, but this is the guide that you would follow in order to find out where you might stay. It gives you corner by corner directions on how to go. Obviously, that wouldn't be a great way to take a hike. You follow the blazes just like you do on the trail, but any specific information you need is in this book. So we're obviously in a big city at this point, but notice the cobblestones are still there. Raining. And this is where we were going up high then, up onto the muddy trails in the forests. Back down again into the villages that have maintained these beautiful stone buildings and stone fences. Around here, you're not too surprised by that, but I'm kind of a Midwesterner, and so I'm really intrigued with stone buildings, stone fences, and the fact that these have been there so long. So again, people leaving things for special reasons. What day are we on?
Yeah, let me talk about this.
Here's the video. We'll get the video going while Greg talks. You can see the rain coming down.
So our host this day told us not to leave early. And we always tried to leave early. But once we crossed the border into Spain, there was a time change, and it didn't really get light until about 8:30 a.m. And she said, don't go early because it won't be safe. And the people that were staying with us left early, just like we would have left early, but we thought we wouldn't leave early because she told us not to. And if we had tried to walk this walk like this in the
dark.
in the dark, I don't know if we would have made it because it was slippery enough as it was, and the water was really high. We just love this picture because they're like
Buckeyes.
they're Buckeye, yeah. So anyway, these are all water. These are all water water. What do they call them?
Like facilities.
People have left their shells with their names on them. We ended up that day in the town where St. James's apostles found his body when it was washed up out of the sea. And they took it by boat up to Padrón. So we took the boat too. So let's turn this on. But the boat didn't leave until 2 in the afternoon. So we had time for a nice breakfast.
That's a quick one.
Look at that. Look at that. Register this thing. Oh, he's got it. Jane's got it.
So we did eat quite well. The food there is quite inexpensive, so.
Very good.
So this is the captain of this boat. It held about 23 people and took us, instead of walking, I think it was about 20 kilometers. This is a way to go by sea, and it is,
By river.
I'm sorry, by river, historically said to be the way that St. James' body would have been taken up to Santiago. I'm sorry, to Padrón. These amazing fortresses still there. It was just a nice break to go on the small boat. This is the city of Padrón. And about the time that I get up and start walking, we start following this group who had been with us on that boat. And we're walking, walking, and walking, not really paying attention to much because we're following them. Then we realize that they are going to some crazy resort. It has nothing to do with where we're supposed to be going. So we had to backtrack and do all that. So these things can happen, but fortunately it wasn't raining. This is where we were trying to get to, the Castel Murgadon. And it's just fun the way these albergues are each unique, but very comfortable and very inexpensive. The next day we leave in the rain. That's one of the really old marking crosses that people would have followed.
Yes.
Then that was a fabulous place.
Oh, that
This place,
Tio.
you want to tell how it had 3 rooms?
Yeah, we rented a whole house in Tio. It turned out it was going to be, anyway, it had 3 rooms and the kitchen. It was incredible. And a cafe across the street and a pharmacy down the block and a grocery store. So it had everything a pilgrim would ever want.
And that beautiful
And-
view.
And when I go back, I'm going to stay there again. We started, so we're now only 12 kilometers away from Santiago. And when I realized that, it was a little bit emotional, actually, because I hadn't been thinking about actually arriving anywhere. And all of a sudden, oh my gosh, are you serious? 2 days, 1 day, and we're done? I wasn't sure how I felt about that. We still got one more mountain to go up and down before we arrive. So if you look in the distance framed between those buildings, you're going to see the cathedral. So that's where everybody's headed.
The wind was blowing about 50 miles an hour.
At this point, we didn't really know how to get to the cathedral. That's the hardest part of finding your way, is when you get into a city. You don't know where to go. So we just kept walking until we could keep seeing that in the distance, and then we were going to get there, right? So this is the square that everybody arrives on when they get there, and there's usually a whole lot of celebration going on. Even in the rain, there was a lot of celebration going on, like that.
Is that a video?
Yeah, it is. Forgot that. The sound isn't playing.
Yeah,
They-
all right.
It was 2 o'clock, so you actually got to hear 2 bells. We did go to a mass the next morning in the cathedral, and it was all in Spanish for 1 hour. And at that time, I didn't have any Spanish, so that was maybe not as meaningful as later that morning when we went back to the pilgrim office, which is where we got our Compostela that you see there. And they have an English language mass most every morning at 10:30. And that one made me cry. That was touching. Most pilgrims want to apply for and receive a Compostela. I think I said you have to walk 100 kilometers. We walked 263. And you show, by showing your pilgrim passport, you show that you've walked those places. And they ask you why you walked. And if you give a reason that the church considers a religious reason, you get this Compostela. If you just walk for the exercise, you still get a certificate of completion, but it's different. So this is just a picture of our 2 Compostelas framed by the pilgrim's passports, top and bottom. Yeah. So to close this out, I just wanted to say that I wish I had thought of this answer to the question that we got when we bussed back to Porto, because now we're way up there. We have to get back to Porto. So we bussed back to Porto and stayed in the same hostel that we started in, and there was a couple down at breakfast because they had a breakfast room there. And I asked if they spoke English, and they were from Australia. So we talked. They were just starting out, and we were just finishing up. And so, of course, they were real interested in our experiences. And one question that they asked us was, "Would you do it again?" And I wish I had known then what I realize now. And I wished and I didn't answer it this way, but if I could have, I would have said something along these lines. Don't become addicted to the Camino. Become addicted to the lessons it taught you. Find a way to live in service to the world. Live simply. Be hospitable to strangers. Share your provisions. Eat with new friends. Come for your body. Notice things. Sleep more. On the Camino, you had to accept so much you had no control over and deal with the problems that you encountered. Do that every day. Where you are with what you have. You never finish a Camino. You merely change the mode and means of traveling through life. The Camino can show you what is important in life. The real work begins when you get home. Go on small pilgrimages closer to home. I call that spiritual hygiene, like taking a bath once a year, whether you need it or not. But don't start seeing pilgrimage as something better than the rest of your life. Allow it to transform you so that the rest of your life is full of it every day.
Greg and James, thank you very much. Now, being that I am an old person, I forgot the most important thing today, and that is a piece of pottery. So you're gonna have to come back next month because I am going to give the presentation, and it's going to be on a recent trip that I did to Antarctica. So come back.
Okay.
And for the rest of you, please come back too. Thank you very much. And Mark, we're going to see what we can do to help you. No, see what we can do to celebrate the 150th correctly. Thank you. Thank you.
Where you get some food and some wonderful coffee made by a.
Well, yeah.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.